a particular period of capitalism and concentrate on what I think is the neoliberal period beginning around late 70s, mid-late 70s. So what do I mean by neoliberalism? When we talk to working people, we don't use the word because it's confusing, right? In today's context, liberal means something very different than what this term means. This refers back to the 19th century version of free markets. Okay, so what is neoliberalism? This is the model. What I'm going to share with you is what we do in the programs that we've developed for working people in unions around the country. A version of this I just used 2 days ago with the New Jersey Education Association. 220 people were there for this one. But I'm focusing on just a few of the pieces for you all today. All right, so what is neoliberalism? The first piece, well, let me just say, this grew up and took hold in the 1970s. It became the Keynesians looked like they were failing, that we had both inflation and unemployment at the same time. We had, two big oil shocks, and the established policy community didn't know how to handle it. And in came the Milton Friedman kind of a conservative free market school. And they said, look, we can solve this for you. You just have to follow this plan. And this plan more or less got adopted by both political parties. I think Jimmy Carter was the first one to kind of get into this. And then, of course, Reagan took over, and this was going on with Margaret Thatcher big time in England. But I'm going to give you a very rarefied, simplified version. First element is cut taxes. And we all know this means cut taxes on the wealthy is usually what happens, because they will invest it. If they cut taxes on us, we're just going to spend it. So you have tax cuts. That's element number one. Element number two is deregulation. And what they were they're talking about everything, environment, OSHA, all that stuff. But what they really meant deep down was free Wall Street from 30 years of very tight regulations that grew out of the New Deal, and stop coddling unions, crush them if you can. And because unions are in the workplace, that's the biggest regulation that you have to worry about, not stuff coming in from the outside. The third element was cut government social spending. So few people as possible get anything for nothing. So they'll be hungry and they'll go out and work. And finally, privatize every public function you can think of, because the private sector is always more efficient than the public sector. No matter what, post office, education, you name it, we should privatize it. All that comes together, and investment goes up, profits go up, and then all boats will rise. This is what was sold to both political parties. And you can hear echoes in this all over the place. When people talk about, when we don't use the word neoliberalism, we use the better business climate model. And that's what, how do we make our area more friendly to business? We've heard that, thousands of times. Okay. So what happens as a result of this model? You can see it pretty clearly. I hope everybody can see this. If not, I'll try to explain it. The first line here is the productivity in the United States from 1947 roughly until today. And it's more or less a 45-degree line, goes up and up and up, sometimes a little flatter, down a little bit, but overall, we become very, very productive. What does productivity mean? It's the sum. The simple definition is the amount of goods and services produced per hour of labor, not how much you pay labor, but per hour of labor calculated across the whole economy. And what it measures is our total level of worker effort, management coordination, infrastructure, education, all that comes together to produce, to make it possible to produce what we produce. And we're roughly 3 times as productive per hour of labor as we were in 1947. And we probably have 2.5 times as many people working, maybe 3 times as many people working. So we produce a lot of stuff, alienated, unalienated, and everything in between. Probably most of it alienated, but we produce a lot of stuff. Now, the second line I'm going to show you is the average weekly wage of the non-supervisory and production worker. That's 85% of all the working people in this country. We're going to there, and this is real wages after you take out the impact of inflation. From 47 till the mid 1970s, late 1970s, every time productivity went up, real wages went up for the average worker. So there was, in fact, a rising standard of living in America across the board. There was a gap between white, black, and brown, but all three categories, and men and women, all the categories were going up from 1947 till the mid 70s. Matter of fact, when I was in grad school, right about when these two lines were still together, they told us this was more or less an iron law. It was built into capitalism. It wasn't going to change. Well, no sooner did I graduate, they took the iron law and melted it, because here's what's happened since. The average real wage has actually gone down. Now we're going to read, we're hearing a lot in the paper today that wages are booming, et cetera, but so are prices. So we'll see what the average real wage is in the next couple of years. But it's actually gone, we peaked in 1977. Working people had the average working person had their highest standard of living in 1977. So we've had 40 years, more than 40 years of stagnation for the average working person. Now we're talking about several generations. And I think this is a key factor behind authoritarianism. So let's let the rise of authoritarianism. Let's move on here to, oh, by the way, if we stayed on the line, the average weekly wage today would be double what it is now. Double. So where did all that money go? Where did it all go? The gap between the two lines, by the way, is roughly $2.5 trillion a year now. That money went someplace else. It didn't go to working people. All right. So first place to look would be what happened to CEO pay, CEO versus the average worker. 1970, the gap was 45-1. Pretty big gap. Pretty big gap. It means like if you could afford one car, they could afford 45 cars. One house, 45 houses. Send one kid to school, send 45 kids to school. 1980 up to 127-1. 1990, 326-1. Today, I mean, in this last decade, 802-1. Almost incomprehensible. So it's pretty clear the money floated to the top. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I could show you, dozens of charts that confirm this from different angles. Now, how did the attack on unions turn out, the deregulation part of it? Well, here's private sector unionism since early 1970s. Kind of peaked again, 1977. There were about 15 million people. We're down to about 7 million people in private sector unions. What about public sector unions? Well, they went up, especially in the early 70s, then sort of going flat, now coming down. The attack on public sector unions, or at least holding them at bay. There are now actually more public sector workers than there are private sector workers. So the attack on unions has been pretty successful. How about the deregulation of finance? Again, there's 50 charts to show you this, but I'm just going to pick one, which is the assets owned by the top 4 banks, just 4 banks. 1992, that was 10.5%. Today, the top 4 banks have over 50% of all the financial assets in the country. 4 banks. So I think the deregulation from Wall Street's perspective worked beautifully. And these banks can never fail. I don't care what anybody says. They can never fail. Okay, so this was not just a change in economic policy. It also changed, I think, the way most people viewed the world. And this is kind of very scary. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know how to put this, since I came of age before neoliberalism, I have some actual real sense of how this has changed. Here's one that you'll love. If you want an education today, you're supposed to go into debt. I mean, it's just assumed you're going to go into debt. Now, in the 1960s, if you had a summer job, you could afford to go to virtually any state school in the country. And if you lived in New York or you lived in California, it was tuition free. That's what normal was. But today, you raise that and it's, oh my God, it's a tremendously radical social democratic reform. This was the norm of the 1960s. It's hard to describe the 1960s as, a socialist utopia in America, but this was the norm. All right, here's another one. If you're poor or jobless today, it's assumed it's your fault. Somehow you have not worked hard enough. You have not picked yourself up by your bootstraps. You have not, paid enough attention in Jay's classes. It's been a problem for you. Again, in the 1960s, it was understood that poverty was rediscovered, Michael Harrington, then the Kennedys, et cetera, that poverty was a function of a structure of capitalism. There weren't enough jobs in the inner city. There weren't enough jobs in Appalachia. It was a black and a white problem. It wasn't your fault. It was something that society had to do something about. All right, here's another one. And this I've mentioned already, but today, if you're a public sector worker, it's assumed you're less valuable than a private sector worker. Now, this again is a flip of the 1960s. The Kennedys, again, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. The idea of public service, it was a high calling. I don't know if you guys remember, and gals, the movie The Graduate, right? The punchline was plastics. The idea that you would go work in the plastics industry as a high calling was a joke. Everybody laughed in 1969 when that phrase came up in the movie. I hate to admit it, but it was hard to get a summer job as a postal worker. You had to pass a test. You had to score high. And I didn't score high enough to get the job. Public service was a good thing, not a bad thing. Look how much that has changed. And finally, if you want a poverty program, go to jail. Let me show you some data that supports this. This chart shows the rise in student loans in trillions of dollars. Today, it's 1.7 trillion. There's more student debt than there is credit card debt. Think of the burden on this, it's basically peonage for students and their families, for many, for a long, long time, debt peonage. All right, here's an interesting one. We tell our kids to get a high school diploma at the very least, right? At least get a high school diploma. So here's some data on high school grads 17 to 20 years old. And it's how many are unemployed and underemployed by group. Underemployed means they have a part-time job, they want a full-time job. Black kids, these are high school graduates, 17 to 20 years old, over 40% unemployed or underemployed. Latino, 26.9%. Anglo, 25.2%. It's worse for African-American kids, but it's pretty bad across the board. Oh, by the way, here's Denmark. Same statistic, 2%. What a difference between our neoliberal version and their neoliberal version. So what happens to these kids? What happens to the people who don't have, pull themselves up properly by their bootstraps? We have an answer. Let me show you the prison population. From 1910 on, by the way, it's the same, the chart is exactly the same in shape if we look at percentage of the population. 1910, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Now we hit the it's basically very, very low. Now we hit the 1960s and 70s. We were a wild bunch, sex, drugs, rock and roll, hardly goes up. Now watch what happens when neoliberalism hits, 1980, 85, watch this. It goes from about 150,000 to today, we've got over almost 2.3 million people in jail. I would say that's a pretty strong case for unfreedom. 2.286 million people in jail. We lead the world, not just in raw number, but in percent as well. And we talk about drug overdoses. We now have there's a whole book called Deaths of Despair. That number, that shape is exactly the same shape as the neoliberal inequality. We've got over 100,000 deaths per year now. By the way, most of these are Anglo. And that's gone up from like 2,500 a year back in the wild 1960s when everybody was getting stoned. not this. How is this now the cauldron for authoritarianism? Well, one thing wealthy people do, the more money you put to the top, the more money they put into politics. So that they get a grip on the political system. This is the corporate contributions just since 1992. We're up now, you can see a big jump after Citizens United. We're up to almost $6 billion a year invested in politics. By the way, labor invests about 120 million. So it's 200 million. We're talking 6 billion versus 200 million. All right. And this is how it comes together. In order to have authoritarianism, you have to destroy the idea of the public good. And the expression of the public good is government, is the idea that government can actually be something that can serve people. So attitudes toward government is, I think, a very important thing to keep an eye on. And it's absolutely collapsed. In the 60s, 77% in 1964 had a favorable view of government. And now it's down to 24%. How does this play out in frustration and in voting patterns? Let's take a look at the Trump vote. We did a study of the Trump vote in Pennsylvania. And I went into the study firmly believing that blue collar workers were not as populist as Jeremiah had postulated, as the media said, that they were more split, more Biden oriented. And I was shocked to come up with the results we came up. We looked at 3,000 voting districts and ran regressions on them to try to figure out what was the independent impact of different variables, holding everything else constant as you move from neighborhood to neighborhood. And it turned out that the strongest indicators for the Trump vote would be older people and blue collar workers, mostly blue collar men, holding everything else constant. Now, many of these voters, many of them voted for, blue collar voters voted for Obama. There's a group of people up for grabs. I just want to tell you what I do and then I'll stop. How do we fight rising authoritarianism? What we do is we try to get into dialogue with people who don't agree with us. We try to go for more centrist blue collar workers around the country. We try to set up training programs where we train trainers. We have like an 8-hour version of what I just went through, which I'll show you where to get. It's free. You can take it whatever you want, use it however you want to use it. But we want to talk to people in an educational setting, which we think is the least threatening to anybody, and have people from their own unions run these training programs. We have a very large one going on with Communication Workers of America. It's actually very good local in Staten Island that does this. There's about 60 of them who are trainers. They train in pairs. The union, God bless them, takes 1,000 people a year out of work for a day, pays them to go through an 8-hour version of this Runaway Inequality curriculum. And they believe it has a major impact on fighting fascism, authoritarian attitudes within their own union. They had over a third of their people voted for Trump, they think, probably higher. So that's what we try to do. We're privileged to have these openings. We're trying to do the same thing inside the Teamsters, inside the food commercial workers, side of other unions. But all we can do is urge everybody to try to reach out to people that don't already agree with us. Let's widen the conversation and see if we can't engage in dialogue. If you want more information, check out runawayinequality.org. The curriculum's there. You can have it. And I'll talk to Jay later about trying to get you more books. There's a special offer right now. We're going to give you books for free over Jay. So contact me and I'll get you some. All right. Thank you very much. And thanks again for inviting me here.